afternoon. This is Asia in Review in the ThinkTech radio series, and we have a special show today. We are honored to have with us Ambassador Charles W. Freeman, former U.S. State Department Director of Chinese Affairs and a prominent policy commentator. He's joining us from Washington, D.C., and we are going to talk about the next 40 years and the key issues affecting U.S.-China relations. Welcome to the show, Ambassador.
Glad to be with you.
Ambassador Freeman served in the U.S. Foreign Service and the State and Defense Departments in many different capacities over the past 30 years. He held many distinguished positions. In addition to the Director of Chinese Affairs, his long list of positions include Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, President of the Middle East Policy Council, co-chair of the U.S.-China Policy Foundation, and a lifetime director of the Atlantic Council. And of interest to our viewers today, Ambassador Freeman served as the main interpreter for Richard Nixon during his 1972 China visit and has been an engine of the U.S.-China relationship over the years. Ambassador Freeman will come to Honolulu tomorrow, as a matter of fact, or is it Wednesday, and deliver a free public lecture October 9th at 4 p.m. at the East-West Center on his latest book, which is called Interesting Times, China, America, and the Shifting Balance of Prestige. So we are really delighted to have you on the show, Ambassador. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, and I'm looking forward to arriving in Honolulu tomorrow.
My co-host for this show is Jiang of the University of Hawaii, Manoa. So Hung, thank you so much for joining us today, and we're going to turn it over to you to interview the ambassador on matters of interest and relating to his speech on Wednesday.
你好，欢迎。
你好，谢谢。
It's amazing you were there in 1972. I remember as a little girl, Nixon was visiting China and you were the interpreter going to China with him, and basically started the U.S.-China relationship. And 41 years onward now, can you, this is going to be like our question already, but we'll give you just a couple minutes to recount some of the major moments of U.S.-China relationship in the last 41 years, and also tell us, where are we now?
Well, it's been an adventure. In 1972, China was still in the grips of the Cultural Revolution. And when I arrived in Beijing, never having been there before, one of the things that really struck me was that it was a cultural desert. There was nothing to read. People were not reading. And of course, everybody was dressed the same way, very drably. There was no color in the place. And I watched China over the succeeding 41 years bloom, come from winter into spring and summer. Women began to wear colorful clothing and wear makeup, and men to wear Western suits, and an explosion of literature. China is now one of the great publishing centers, and Chinese is one of the great languages for new works being published in the world. China in 1972, when I arrived in Shanghai at the Hongqiao airport, I could hear the birds singing. There were no planes. If you go to Pudong airport today, or for that matter Beijing, these are two of the busiest airports in the world, and this just symbolizes the extraordinary changes that have taken place. In 1972, to use today's dollars, per capita income, that is per capita GDP, in Beijing was about $130. It's over 14,000 now, and in terms of purchasing power, probably more like 21,000. So this is a 100-fold increase in the standard of living. And I will talk on Wednesday a bit about these changes and the remarkable ways in which China has integrated itself into the world and become a contributor to the world since I first encountered it as an angry, isolated, and very backwards society.
So clearly, China has gone a long way since 1972, and U.S.-China relationship also has gone a long way. And now the talk you have is about shifting U.S.-China balance, and there seems to be something that's not the dynamics are very, very different now, and China definitely is not 1972, where there are a lot of poverty there, as you talk about all the drastic growth, economic growth in its position in the world. So U.S. has to contend a little bit more with China in its relationship. And U.S. has just this pivot toward the Asia Pacific area. What does that mean in terms of U.S.-China relationship?
Well, I think the so-called pivot is, which I will also talk about in some detail on Wednesday. I think the so-called pivot is a very questionable concept. In terms of U.S.-China relationship, it represents first a recognition on the part of the United States that the Asia-Pacific region, or more broadly, the Indo-Pacific region, are now becoming the global center of economic gravity, and that any sensible policy on a global level by the United States, any strategy, must emphasize Asia to an extent that it didn't before. And so the pivot, in a sense, is simply a recognition of the rising importance of Asia, and of course China is a major contributor to that. That's at one level. But there are as many pivots as there are bureaucracies in Washington. Of course, they're all shut down at the moment, which may be a blessing.
That's right.
But if you talk to people who do national security, military stuff, they see China as a military competitor. And their concern is that as China develops the capacity to defend itself, which it hasn't really had effectively for a couple of centuries, and as it modernizes its military and begins to project power beyond its immediate borders, that this interferes with the American dominance of the Western Pacific that has been the norm since 1945, when we overthrew the Japanese Imperial Navy's power, and of course they had earlier destroyed European imperialist power. So China is a challenge not so much to our homeland, it's not a menace to our homeland, but it is a threat to our so far unchallenged superiority in the military sphere. Economically, obviously, China, which was nothing to speak of in 1972, is now about to become the world's largest economy again. That's a position it occupied until about 1850, when the Brits displaced it in that rank. So economically, China is now an increasingly, well, I would say it's an essential factor in solving any global or regional economic issue. And politically, China, although it continues to have a rather unattractive domestic political system, is more and more influential abroad. It's active on every continent, and it can't be ignored. So I think, in a sense, the pivot is simply a recognition of emerging realities.
In terms of China's rise, it's been talked about, and it's also a big question in China. And some people have seen U.S.-China having more of a conflict as China started to rise, because clearly, U.S. is occupying that supreme position for a long time. And what do you see as a possible kind of conflict as China rises? And also, what is the U.S. strategic position in relationship with China right now?
Well, if you look for a fight, you can always find one, in my experience. But I don't think there's anything inevitable about a clash between the United States and China. We really don't have any reason to fight. The best reason that anybody's been able to come up with up to now is the Taiwan issue. But that's receding as people in Taipei and Beijing work towards some sort of modus vivendi, and perhaps an eventual political settlement of their differences, the differences being over the relationship of Taiwan to the rest of China. So that's going away. The major difficulty, I suppose, is what is called often called the Thucydides trap. That is the sort of trap that Athens and Sparta fell into in the Peloponnesian Wars. This is the contest. I mean, some people believe there's something inevitable about established powers, in this case the United States, and rising powers, in this case China, returning to wealth and power, getting into conflict. And it's certainly worth remembering that the Peloponnesian War began not because Athens and Sparta went at each other directly, but because their allies got them into trouble. And the U.S. has an alliance structure in Asia that China is pressing against because it has territorial disputes with Japan and with the Philippines and other countries which are not U.S. allies like Vietnam and Malaysia and so forth. And so I think the thesis is that these differences will get us into trouble. But when you think about it, it doesn't make any sense at all. The Diaoyu Islands or Senkaku Islands are a bunch of uninhabited rocks with nothing but goats on them. And going to war over goats and rocks doesn't sound very sensible. The South China Sea Islands are barely above water, and global warming is likely to solve that problem before too long. And certainly the United States has no interest whatsoever in who owns those islands, but only in how they're managed. So I don't buy into the thesis that there is anything inevitable, even very likely, about a U.S.-China military confrontation.
Ambassador, we're going to take a break in 2 or 3 minutes, but before we do, I'd like to throw in a question on you. And that is, it's become obvious, and we've had many shows here at ThinkTech Asia in Review about it, that the Chinese are coming to the U.S. They're studying in schools, they're buying land and businesses. They are learning so much. I mean, we had a program last week involving a number of Chinese lawyers and law professors who were over here to observe a jury trial because they feel the jury trial is the best expression of the rule of law. They want to adopt that in China. They want to learn everything they can. On the other hand, you don't see it going west. You don't see all that many American students studying in China. You don't see people going simply to learn about China. We have more of an isolationist kind of approach to it, and I'd like to know your thoughts about that and how that plays, in the balance that we are having right now, the attempt to balance the relationship.
Well, I think China has, certainly from the time of Deng Xiaoping and the reforms that he launched in December 1978, China has very deliberately used the United States and what it can learn from Americans to change itself. And it has changed in very fundamental ways, abandoning many of the elements of Mao's utopian vision and proceeding to invent something that I call cadre capitalism, which is sometimes called socialism with Chinese characteristics, but which has proven to be a mighty engine of economic development and spreading prosperity. And the Chinese are here learning from us because they think they can benefit from that. So they're smart. I think they can indeed benefit from, they have benefited from their contacts with us. And if we're stupid and don't think we can benefit from contact with them, then I don't suppose there's much that they can do about that. I think our country at the moment, with a government that's shut down and with no ability to set strategic priorities domestically, and still less abroad, is in real trouble. And I think we need to step back for a moment and realize we need to get our act together. Part of that is learning from others and doing our own opening and reform.
Yes. Thank you, Ambassador. We're going to take a short break. I'm Jay Fidell. This is ThinkTech Asia in Review, and we are talking to Ambassador Charles W. Freeman, former U.S. State Department Director of Chinese Affairs and a prominent policy commentator. Today we're talking about the next 40 years, key issues affecting U.S.-China relations. We'll be right back, and my co-host Hong Jiang will resume her questions right after this break.
I'm Bill Spencer, President of the Hawaii Venture Capital Association. We do monthly luncheon programs with ThinkTech about things that matter to Hawaii entrepreneurs, investors, and business service providers. So join us on the fourth Thursday of every month at the Plaza Club. For information about upcoming events or to join our mailing list, visit hvca.org. See you there.
We're back, we're live, we're ThinkTech Asia in Review on Monday with Ambassador Chaz W. Freeman, former U.S. State Department Director of Chinese Affairs and prominent policy commentator on China. And I am with my co-host, Hong Jiang of the University of Hawaii, Manoa, who has a couple of other questions for the Ambassador.
Hi, Ambassador. So we were, before the break, just talk about the imbalance. And there's another imbalance that I'd like to explore with you, which is China's soft power expansion and the imbalance there in terms of the other way around. And there are a lot of effort from the Chinese government expanding outside of China into the U.S. in terms of media culture and influencing the overseas Chinese. And a couple of things about the media. Washington Post website actually hosts the China Daily newspaper, which is clearly connected to the Chinese government. And Xinhua's news agency has this, it's a North America headquarters right in the middle of Times Square. So we see a lot of that expansion, and also we have it in Hawaii in terms of Chinese government-sponsored Confucius Institute. So there are a lot of, if you say the euphemism kind of a term, outreach or influence by the Chinese Communist Party coming out of China into the U.S. There isn't a lot of going on the reverse side. So is that a concern?
Well, I think you have to recognize that for the entire post-war and Cold War periods, the United States was the dominant factor in global media and global culture, and everybody complained about Americanization going on all over the place. And we also had, during that period, a very active outreach program through the U.S. Information Service. We had cultural centers in many places, American libraries. We placed items in the press. I actually ran afoul on my first tour at the Foreign Service, ran afoul of the ambassador and got bounced out of the regular jobs and into one of these USIS jobs. So I know it well. We made a real effort. Somehow, when the Cold War ended, we decided we didn't need to do that anymore. CNN, I guess, or Fox News or somebody was going to tell our story for us. And so we euthanized the U.S. Information Agency. And that was a great mistake because we essentially abandoned public diplomacy. China's come at it very late, and it's playing catch up. And I think it's a good thing. People don't know a lot about China. Everybody knows English. Hardly anybody knows Chinese. So the Confucius Centers, for example, teach language and expose people to information about China, and that's wonderful. And I wish, in effect, we would recognize that Fox News is not exactly the way we ought to be trying to portray ourselves to the world, quite the opposite. And I think we should reinvent public diplomacy, and we should recognize that we've slipped back quite a bit in the last 20-some years from where we once were. China's not caught up, but it's trying hard. and I give it a lot of credit for that.
I can definitely start to see the influence there. I know the Confucius Institute a couple years ago invited a speaker here coming to University of Hawaii, gave a talk, and used China as an example for human rights improvements, which of course, China has its definition of human rights, and in the U.S. we tend to have a concern about China's record. So also China's expansion into the U.S., connection with the U.S., or U.S. expansion with connection with China, tend to be government-based. Honolulu has built sister cities with certain cities in China, and the Chinese soft power expansion outside of China. Anybody here in Honolulu can watch CCTV if they pay for it, and so it's reaching to the people, while the U.S. outreach seems to be reaching the government of China. So that's another area of imbalance that I suppose if we have a more of a diplomacy, public diplomacy, that might help to address.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think there are restrictions on Chinese citizens' access to international media. Of course, you can read Sankaoxiaoxi, the reference news, and get a lot of information. The internet is changing everything. But the fact is that ordinary Chinese can't get foreign television. It's available in hotels and not more generally. So we have a very free media environment in the United States, and China doesn't. And China has its reasons for that, which it is willing to explain. And as you said, China has a different view of human rights. I don't happen to agree with it, but I understand it. And so I think we're comparing, in a sense, if not apples and oranges, maybe mangoes and grapes.
And that's where I just wonder, as we connect more with China in this globalized world, and China rises to play a more important role in the world, would that create some kind of conflict?
Well, I think Chinese views are going to weigh more heavily internationally, just because China is resuming its traditional weight in global affairs, or now it is operating not simply in an East Asian context, but in a global context, and it's bound to become more influential. The changes happen and nobody notices. I can tell you, because I'm ancient and decrepit, that when in my youth, the idea that anybody would eat raw fish or seaweed wrapped rice would have appalled people. But every American now loves sushi, and nobody thinks of it as anything strange. Even Chinese like it, which is even more strange. And so I think this is an instance of the Japanese cultural influence coming into Western culture in the United States first, and then elsewhere. And I think Chinese influences are bound to come in too. Some of those will be ideas, some of them will be other things, and I hope they're not cantopop, but I won't be around to see that anyway.
From what you're saying, this discussion, the elephant in the room, at least one elephant in the room, is how Congress is conducting itself. And I've heard a number of commentators in the last few days saying that the U.S. is losing ground with the world, losing credibility, losing position in the marketplace. Its commercial paper is less valuable, and so forth. Price of the value of the dollar, the credibility of the dollar, and it could get worse on October 17th. And some say that the Chinese will stick it out with us, hold on to our paper, and not be bothered by any effect of this. But I wonder what you think the Chinese think about the failure of Congress to act on critical fiscal issues like this. Are we losing ground? Are they gaining ground? What is their reaction to it?
Well, I don't think this is really about the United States and China. I think China is one of many countries that is, frankly, perplexed, if not disgusted, by the behavior of Congress. Mark Twain called Congress the closest thing to a Native American criminal class, and I guess they're living up to that reputation. And I fully sympathize with people who carry placards that tell the Congress, you do your job and I'll do mine, or if you do your job, I'll be able to do mine. And they're not doing their job. Quite the contrary. They are flirting with an absolute catastrophe in the global economy by, in effect, threatening to go over the default cliff. I don't think people understand quite how serious that would be. So my guess is that the Congress is behaving so irresponsibly that not just China, but many other countries, and Japan is one of them, if they're not just Asians, they're Europeans as well, and others, are very likely to get together and ask themselves what they can do to limit the risk that they bear by allowing the United States to retain the advantages of operating a global currency, operating a global debt system in which our treasury bonds have been the underpinning for almost every the collateral, basic collateral underlying almost every financial transaction around the globe. That's fine until the United States, behaves like the African American sheriff in Blazing Saddles, and holds a gun to our head and says, get out of my way or I'll blow my brains out. We're behaving completely irresponsibly, and I don't think it's acceptable to the world. And I think this time we may really have done it, and we will find people getting together to figure out how to work around us rather than with us. I hope that's...
Going to the Chinese, though, they hold our paper, which is, a mainstay of our economy, that they hold our paper. They don't sell our paper, redeem our paper. And I just wonder, assuming that we go over the cliff, what are the Chinese likely to do? Do you have any thought about that? Are they going to stick it out with us, or are they going to drop our paper?
Hey, nobody's going to stick it out with us if we go over the cliff. The Chinese have about $1.3 trillion in treasury debt that they hold. Japan about $1.1 trillion. These are major parts of their foreign exchange holdings, although probably about a third in the case of China, or somewhat more than that. And if we behave with the irresponsibility that some people in Congress are threatening to do, I think we're going to be out of business internationally in important ways, not just with China, but with everybody else.
This could be very serious, and it could be very soon.
This is about the equivalent of nuclear winter in economic terms that we're talking about. And the country doesn't seem to realize it, and some of those who are threatening to do it don't seem to realize it or don't care. After all, my friend Grover Norquist has said that his objective is to shrink the federal government to the point where it can be drowned in the bathtub.
On that note, I'd be inclined to take a short break. That's Ambassador Charles W. Freeman, former U.S. State Department Director of Chinese Affairs and a prominent policy commentator on China. With me is my co-host Hong Jiang of UH Manoa. We're talking about the next 40 years, key issues affecting U.S.-China relations, in anticipation of Ambassador Freeman's speech at the East-West Center this Wednesday at 4 p.m. In a public speech, a free speech. So we'll be right back after this break.
Aloha, I'm Nicole Horry for ThinkTech. For nearly half a century, the Hawaii Foreign Trade Zone No. 9 has brought the benefits of the Foreign Trade Zone program to Hawaii businesses and entrepreneurs. DBET, the Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism, operates Hawaii's Foreign Trade Zone program to encourage international business and economic development. The Foreign Trade Zone's mission is to increase the amount of international trading activity in Hawaii, thereby providing employment opportunities for the residents of our island state. For more information, see ftz9.org. I'm Nicole Horry. Mahalo.
We're back. We're live. We're here with Ambassador Charles W. Freeman, former U.S. State Department Director of Chinese Affairs, here on ThinkTech Asia in Review. My co-host Han Jiang. and of UH Manoa. We're talking about the next 40 years, key issues affecting U.S.-China relations in anticipation of Ambassador Freeman's visit to Hawaii, where he will speak on Wednesday this week at 4 p.m. at the East West Center on his latest book, Interesting Times, China, America, and the Shifting Balance of Prestige. Boy, what a perfect time to write that book.
Definitely, and we're anticipating another book from you very, very soon because things are changing so fast. And one thing that I want to ask is this question of China's internal pressures. Because, I remember reading another a commentary from another Chinese expert like you, like Zhong Guotong, who speak the Chinese language and talk about the difference of the different Chinas. They're China referring to the Chinese government, China referring to the Chinese people, and the two are not getting along, in fact. And there are a lot of problems in China. We talk about over 200,000 protests, large scale in the Chinese country. We're talking about China spending more in internal stability than in the military. So there seems to be a very interesting phenomena. The Chinese biggest enemy, Chinese government's biggest enemy is the Chinese people. And in that sense, if there's any kind of a thing happening in China, any spillover, how is that going to likely affect U.S.-China relationship?
Well, we've seen major effects before when the Chinese system has gone through a convulsion. I'm speaking of the Liusa or the Tiananmen student uprising and its suppression. That basically drained the warmth from U.S.-China relations and it shoved them into the deep freeze for quite a long time. It's taken us a while to come back from that, and it's left a legacy in terms of the sanctions that remain in effect from the United States on China. So if there is some kind of internal breakdown in China, it certainly will have a huge effect on U.S.-China relations. And I would say, given China's weight in the world, it would have a big effect on the rest of the world too. So nobody should want anything but success for China in terms of continuing domestic tranquility and progress. And you mentioned a number of factors, a huge number of significant protests, that is, protests that are large enough to require police intervention, which is, I think, the 200,000 figure you're talking about. A great number of those protests have to do with, or they're provoked by the environmental consequences of actions by local officials or business people. China has pushed industrial and other economic development so rapidly that it has greatly overburdened its environment. And in some respects, it seems to be close to the breaking point. We actually now have migrants to the United States from China who are, in effect, climate or pollution refugees.
Interesting.
People who are buying, who are investing in order to get a visa, an investor visa, but whose basic motivation is to get away from the sort of smog that Beijing suffered earlier this year, which was appalling. So I think, to the government's credit, it has recognized that this is a crisis and is now turning around and trying to deal with it seriously. But there are huge pressures on China, even under the best of circumstances. You know, we're talking about a country that has about 20% of the world's population and only about less than 10% of its arable land, and less than 7% of its water, and it's got to feed everybody with these very limited resources. It has a history of famine and pestilence and invasion from abroad, and its leaders are very risk averse, and rightly so. So I think China doesn't have the margin for error that many other countries do, and this weighs heavily on the Chinese psyche.
Definitely, and talking about all these pressures, I have seen predictions of the basically collapse of the Communist Party in China. That doesn't mean that China would go through chaos if there's any way for some kind of peaceful transition into democracy. Do you see anything like that?
I sort of doubt that the Chinese Communist Party is going to collapse, and I'm not sure it would be a good thing if it did. I think it might be better if it adapted to the new realities of Chinese society, and those are a vastly better educated, more cosmopolitan population. Millions of Chinese now go abroad as tourists. There's a huge middle class emerging in China. Expectations of government and the relationship between the individual and the government have changed radically, and the government, with its sense of vulnerability politically, really hasn't changed enough to accommodate these things. So, but I think I look at the example of the Kuomintang in Taiwan, also a Leninist party, which managed to reform itself from the top and to accommodate the emergence of a modern society in Taiwan. And I think it can be done on the mainland too. The question is, what kind of leaders will China have as it reaches the point where political reform is no longer avoidable?
And China has basically stayed in this transitional stage in terms of political reform for right now over 30 years. The example you have from Taiwan and also the Soviet, of course China didn't like the Soviet example, they do offer these different ways of some kind of political change. And do you see that as a possibility?
Well, I think it's a mistake to underestimate the amount of political change there's already been in China. I mean, I remember China when you basically couldn't whisper anything that the government didn't approve, or I should say more accurately, the party. The scope for individual expression, for freedom of movement within the country, abroad, for access to information and literature and the whole creative scene have expanded tremendously. And within China, there have been a whole series of innovations, elections at the village level, sometimes higher up, discussion within the party of primary systems, a much more predictable succession system, which delivers succession reliably, apparently every 5 or 10 years, on a level that few other societies can match. I mean, you have 80% turnover, which in no Western democracy achieves through an election process. Older people retiring, new people coming in, and each generation is more at home in the world than the one before it. So I don't think it's true that there hasn't been a lot of political change in China. But it is the case that there are some serious missing ingredients, and one of them is trying to deal with the hukou system. Another is expanding the rule of law, which is still lacking in many respects, and trying to make government policy making more transparent, which is in fact happening. Laws in China don't get passed without a wide effort at soliciting public comment in advance, and so I think it's not the case that China's been politically static. It is the case that it faces serious challenges to reform politically.
We're about to take a break, but let me throw a question in before we do, and that is this. 2 weeks ago, Ambassador, we had a program here. ThinkTech organized a program called Don't Be Afraid to Send Your Kid or CEO to China. And we had a lot of China hands, local China hands. In fact, we had Brenda Foster there. She has been the president of the American Chamber in Shanghai for some years. The general sense was that it's a mixed bag to send your kid to China. And I wonder what your view is. Does it benefit our country to send a lot of kids to China? Does it benefit them? Where do you go on that?
Well, I think the more young Americans who learn Chinese are exposed to China, the better. They're not going to become Chinese, but they might become sufficiently well informed to help us deal more intelligently with the China that is now emerging, and we don't have any choice. We share a rather small planet, as it turns out, with the Chinese. We're a hugely important country in that context. We have all sorts of advantages the Chinese don't, even if at the moment, given congressional behavior, it's a little hard to feel too happy about what's going on. The Chinese have huge problems, but they also have a magnificent history, tremendous creativity, and I don't have any doubt at all that they're going to contribute to the world again, as they did in the best periods of their past. So young Americans need to understand this country, need to know how to work with it, need to be open to the new things that are likely to come out of it. And yeah, we should encourage this. We have a program. The President agreed to send 100,000 students to China. Unfortunately, that is not happening. I wish it did.
That's Ambassador Charles W. Freeman, former U.S. State Department Director of Chinese Affairs and prominent policy commentator on China. We're talking about the next 40 years, key issues affecting U.S.-China relations in anticipation of his arrival in Honolulu this week and his speech, his free public speech on Wednesday, October 9th at 4 p.m. in the East-West Center regarding his latest book, Interesting Times, China, America, and the Shifting Balance of Prestige. So my co-host Han Jiang and I will take one last break with you, Ambassador. We'll be back in a moment.
Aloha, my name is Dan Bauer and I'm the General Manager of the Plaza Club. The Plaza Club is Honolulu's premier business club. We're located in the heart of the financial district on historic Fort Street Mall. On the 20th and 21st floors atop the Pioneer Plaza, our commanding skylight views, along with our award-winning cuisine and service, are known as the place to do business downtown. We offer professional as well as social events and programs to our members and their guests, all tailored to enrich their professional and personal lives and to give them the cutting edge that they deserve in business. Why don't you consider becoming a member of the club? Call me at 531-7788 or come see me and let's talk business and how the Plaza Club can work for you. Again, my name is Dan Bauer. I'm the General Manager of the club, and I'm
We're back, we're live, we're ThinkTech Asia in Review with Ambassador Charles W. Freeman, former U.S. State Department Director of Chinese Affairs, talking today about the next 40 years, key issues affecting U.S.-China relations. I'm here with my co-host, Han Jiang, who has a few more questions for this last segment of our show.
Ambassador, to look at China-U.S. relationship, I think we can't neglect the issue of Taiwan. Can you talk about the role Taiwan plays in terms of U.S.-China relationship?
Well, that's been the most difficult issue and a great impediment to our relations. Most Americans don't really understand how important this is to Chinese nationalism. This was an alternative government in a civil war. For 23 years, the United States insisted that its Taipei was the seat of the government of all of China, and that the regime on the mainland was illegitimate. We tried to exclude the mainland from participation in every sort of international affairs and to isolate it. And we had sanctions on the Chinese mainland that were quite as draconian as those we now apply to Iran. So there's a lot of history here, and while the two sides of the strait, Taiwan and the mainland, have made a lot of progress in terms of integrating their economies, reestablishing cultural ties, and working their way towards some kind of major future relaxation of tensions and possibly reunification. It isn't complete. So the Taiwan question always raises the possibility that there will be some sort of rendezvous between the United States and Chinese nationalism that could be very bloody. And it isn't going away as an issue in the near term. So you're right to raise it. It's a constant factor, an irritant, a burden on the relationship, and it pits the American sense of national honor against the Chinese sense of victimization by great powers and and nationalism.
And your book is titled "Interesting Times," and that could be an interesting positive turn. It could be a curse. So we are, living in that kind of juncture and talking about 40 years ahead. What's going to come up? Anything could change, even like between China and Taiwan. But in terms of U.S.-China relationship, what do you see? I'm not asking you to just give us a prediction. I guess some of us may live into that 40 years. But what are the key factors that will tip the balance, that will make a major difference in terms of the outcomes?
Well, I think the United States and China are already economically very interdependent. Culturally, we are quite open to each other, and increasingly so. I don't think these areas of the relationship have anything but bright days ahead of them. There are frictions, of course, in the economic area, differences about intellectual property rights and cyber security and espionage and that sort of thing. These are not trivial disagreements, but they're the sort of thing that countries can work out if they have a mind to do it. And I think both sides do. The troubled area of the relationship is the military. Because, as I said, the United States has become accustomed to the total dominance of the Western Pacific, right up to the 12-mile limit of China's territorial seas. And it's not acceptable to the Chinese, nor would it be acceptable to Americans, that a foreign country camp 12 miles offshore, appearing to prepare itself or to be able to launch an assault at any time on the homeland. So the Chinese are pushing the United States to be more respectful, keep our distance. And if we don't, I think we could get into a kind of pushing and shoving match, probably not one that leads to escalation, but it could be very serious. And I think that's the major danger in the relationship. Fortunately, I think both sides now recognize that, and the meeting at Sunnylands in California between President Obama and President Xi Jinping was devoted in part to trying to manage this sort of problem and keep it under control. And I believe we can. So I'm looking for a more intensely interdependent, interactive, generally friendly, sometimes competitive relationship between the United States and China amidst a continuing development in China toward greater prosperity and I hope greater political openness as well.
It all sounds like a very creative, healthy, challenging experience going forward. I wonder, Ambassador, if you could give us any other elements that you might cover on your speech tomorrow, Wednesday, in these remaining moments. Is there anything else that you want to impart to us about the remarks you're going to be making on Wednesday?
Well, I think I'm going to ask you to wait for Wednesday and find out what I'm going to say.
We would look forward to it.
I think this is an incredibly important relationship, and when the United States became independent, my ancestors, among others, who had been barred from trading with China by the British, immediately headed there. Why? It was by far the world's largest market, the largest economy. When we became independent, China was about a third of the global economy. And it's headed back in that direction. And so, whether we like it or not, China's in our future. And we need to find a way to leverage increasing Chinese prosperity to our own benefit and our own prosperity. And I think we can do that.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Charles W. Freeman, former U.S. State Department Director of Chinese Affairs and a prominent policy commentator, who is coming here to Honolulu to deliver a free public lecture this Wednesday, October 9th at 4 p.m. at the East-West Center regarding his latest book, Interesting Times, China, America, and the Shifting Balance of Prestige. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for joining us.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Hung Jiang.
Thank you.
It's been wonderful to talk to you. We look forward to seeing you when you arrive.
And
I'm sorry?
I look forward to seeing you.
Aloha and Sai Jian.
再见。
再见。